What happened to Jericho? Because text said that they burned city, and this seems
Yes.
like a contradiction. How do you explain
Well,
that?
absolutely. Jericho and I were exceptions. I think that was initially when they came into the land, they were commanded to devote Jericho to, it's sometimes in English called the ban. The Hebrew term is cherem. It is, it means giving back to God what is, after all, his in the first place. And some vessels have been found and some are described as for the temple or for the tabernacle as written on them cherem. In other words, they're devoted to God's use in the temple. But at Jericho, that was entirely, the whole city was to be given back to God. And I think that's what happened there. And yeah, I think it was destroyed. I think, to me, Jericho's a wonderful example of what I would consider a fort. I don't think there were non-combatants in Jericho other than Rahab and her family, who basically, in my view, operated an inn. In chapter 2, I think that's where the spies hid out. I do believe Rahab was a prostitute, but if you look, the law code of Hammurabi, a few centuries earlier, prohibits people from building inns run by women, alewives, or whatever, however that's to be understood, possibly prostitutes, on the walls of any city, for the very reason that things like Joshua chapter 2 could happen. Well, Jericho never got that message, so they allowed that kind of a situation to be built, and that's why I believe Rahab had her inn on the wall. But I believe that Jericho is primarily a fort garrisoned by troops from Jerusalem, from Bethel, and what they perhaps a couple of towns. And because we have roads going directly from Jericho to these towns, the famous road in Jerusalem that goes from Jericho to Jerusalem was made famous in the New Testament, when Jericho was moved slightly in terms of its location, but still in the same area. But in the New Testament, the parable of the Good Samaritan takes place on that road. But they garrisoned this for defense, to protect these roads coming up to Jerusalem, but also to collect taxes and duties on traders and merchants who would be going north-south along the Jordan Valley and east-west, just like the Israelites moved from east of the Jordan across the fords over to west of the Jordan River. And so it would be entirely consistent to have an inn like that of Rahab's there for these travelers to spend the night. And that's exactly where you would expect the spies to come, who were sent to find out, about what's going on, the intelligence in the region. But also, I think the spies were also looking for potential allies that they might find. And of course, they found one in Rahab. And if you look at the story of Jericho takes place, you have the Israelites coming across the Jordan River. They celebrate the Passover. And then immediately after that, they march around the city 7 days during the feast of what would be the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And the verb that's used for that march each day and on the seventh day 7 times is used in the Psalms, in that psalm that talks about walk around Jerusalem and inspect its fortifications, admire how strong it is. I believe this was a ceremonial march with the symbol of the presence of God, the Ark of the Covenant, going around each day to see whether there was any opening, whether Jericho was opening its gate, whether it was allowing the Israelites to come in. So for 7 days, they had the opportunity to open their gate, as it were. And they didn't. And the 7th day, they march around 7 times. So something's going to be happening. This is your last chance, sort of. And then, of course, the walls fall down. This is in keeping with this picture. If you look at what Israel is doing and what God is doing, first of all, the first barrier that Israel comes to is the natural barrier of the Jordan River. And so what does God do? The priests come in carrying the symbol of the presence of God. As soon as their feet touch the Jordan, the river dries up. It is blocked up, actually. It doesn't dry. It's blocked up up river by some rocks and stones, perhaps an earthquake or something, and they march across on dry land. So no natural barrier will stand between God and the onward movement of his people. Jericho represents a human barrier in the form of this fort. And again, the walls fall down, which is exactly what you would expect, because that barrier represented by those walls cannot stand against God. So it's a kind of bit of theology there, but it's also the larger picture, which I think is consistent. And yeah, we don't actually have a burned layer at Jericho because, as I said, we don't have any evidence from any layers that late, which we think very early. It's 3,300, 3,400 years ago, but it's still late in terms of Jericho. Jericho, there's occupation there for thousands of years, and then you have the last layer is maybe the 18th century BC, hundreds of years before the Israelites marched through there. I believe that Jericho was occupied at that time, but the one thing you would expect to find there, if it was a town or something like that, is you would have people who would have nicer pottery, just like today you have nicer tea servings, or I don't know, china or whatever else you might have. Well, that's diagnostic for archaeologists. That changes over the centuries. The more basic pottery doesn't change as much. So you'd have but we don't have any pottery from the 13th century BC Canaan that looks like anything at Jericho. But that's exactly what you would expect if what that was primarily a fort garrisoned by soldiers who came in. They didn't, serve fancy teas or whatever. They just had their basic material for holding their food and holding their drink. So anyway, that's my read on the archaeology of Jericho.